It is my pleasure to welcome Jennifer Senior to our fall conference. Jennifer is a staff writer at The Atlantic, winner of the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Prior to joining The Atlantic, she spent 5 years at the New York Times. Before that, she spent 18 years as a staff writer for New York Magazine. Her first book, All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenthood, spent 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Senior has been a frequent guest on NPR and television programs, including Morning Joe, Anderson Cooper 360, Good Morning America, and Today. Welcome, Jennifer, to our fall conference. We are delighted that you are able to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really admire what you're doing, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Great, well, thank you. To begin, it appears we both have a particular fondness for the word counterfactual.
Yeah. Have you gone through my other stories and discovered that I have a fondness for it there too? I think I do.
It's one of my favorite words. It's a word that means to explore other possibilities of how events might have turned out, both good outcomes and tragic outcomes. Counterfactual means to ask, if this had happened instead of that, what could the result have been? In your experience, is that the role of a journalist, the writer, to explore the facts, to run them counter even, to listen to all sides and interpretations, and then to discern how best to render the truth of what did happen?
So that's a wonderful question, and certainly the most imaginative question I've gotten possibly ever, certainly as an opener. Uh, Let me start by saying that you're in a funny way, it's like you're asking about two things, because this is something I'm obsessed with, right? That as a journalist, we are, of course, obliged to figure out the truth, whatever that is, or get as close to it as possible. That's the cardinal rule, the ordinal rule, whatever you want to call it, to the extent that it can be ascertained. There's, often not one way of looking at anything. Um, in fact, there seldom is, unless it's math or science. But I, I think an underrated value in journalism is looking at why people believe what they do, including lots and lots of wrong stories. And I know that that sounds like I'm about to go on a long disquisition about why Trump believers believe what they do, and we should all go to diners. That was what like the mainstream press did, and that's not actually where I'm headed. Um, I think people tell themselves all kinds of stories. I mean, it's stories they tell themselves. It's not just stories they believe in. I think uh, ask any divorced person. I mean, not everyone's ex can be crazy, right? And yet that's the story that everyone tells, right? But in the case of this story that I wrote about the McIlvaine family, who lost their son on 9/11, his father told himself a conspiracy theory, decided he believed not just a kind of common conspiracy theory, but a really bespoke, strange conspiracy theory that he had gone really deep into a rabbit hole about and done all sorts of kind of promiscuous reading and woven together a whole kind of story. And I was interested in why he believed that, right? And I didn't want to debunk it. It was not in any way my interest to say at any point in the story that I was writing, oh, this is wrong, or this is dangerous, or this. I mean, I did say it was wrong. I had to say that. It was very important that I say that, particularly about 9/11, because, that kind of theory is, if you, most of the conspiracy theories around 9/11 very quickly can kind of be traced back to something very anti-Semitic, and I wanted to make sure that that was not on the table. But I was really preoccupied with figuring out what kind of job that was doing for Bob McIlvaine. And yeah, and then counterfactuals are a whole other thing. But I've talked for a very long time, so I'll talk to you about counterfactuals at some other point.
That's helpful. I want to discuss your book on grief, but I wanted to go to two other places first, if I may. You wrote an article about a professor who became an expert on happiness and yet still jumped from a building in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We all find a way to study ourselves, you wrote, because in exploring the facts of that story, you made an unexpected connection with a death in your own family. How do you think death, grief, distorts or rearranges our sense of facts, of time, and even memory?
I think it rearranges our sense. I think grief needs a villain.
Mm,
That's something that I've learned. I think that people need to assign, um, they be, I mean, anger is a big part of grieving.
mm,
I think that going back to the McIlvaine story for a second, Bob Sr. needed a villain. It became the government. It became a lot of things. I think in the case of Philip Brickman, who died by suicide, um, who could not solve the, the unsolvable, the knot of his own misery. He couldn't undo it.
mm.
He could never dissolve it, that knot. He could never get anywhere with it. And he spent his whole life, I think, in some ways, studying himself through his scholarship. And you are right, I was writing about my own self, unconsciously, I think, and my own family history, because I had somebody who died by suicide jumping from a building too. And I hadn't even realized it until a colleague gingerly asked me whether I had any connection to this material. And at first I said no. But I think that Philip Brickman's students needed a villain. They needed to know, or a culprit. Why did he do it? Why?
Mm,
Um, and so they were looking for some kind of story. Oh, it's because his marriage was failing. Oh, it's because he wasn't successful academic. We don't really know. We can't ever know why someone decides. I think the metaphor I used in that was, I said the best we are is police sketch artists. We're getting kind of a vague description coming in, but we haven't seen it. We don't have any kind of full access to the interior picture. It's conjecture at best. I think it rearranges. So I think it scrambles. I think we don't, in some ways, we're at sixes and sevens because we don't have the imagination for that kind of pain that someone's in if somebody's dying by, suicide. But I think grief is just sort of tests our own imaginative limits and our own ability to sort of understand. People torture themselves trying to figure out what the last moments were of the person who was dying, what they were
right.
feeling, what they were thinking. There's a lot of our own tests of our own empathy and it's torture in a way for us. And it scrambles our sense of time in the sense that, well, there is no time for a while, or there's nothing but time. Time is too
Mm.
thick. It just kind of goes by very slowly, with only our feelings of lead. Um, I think there's a real sensory failure or something,
Mhm.
when we grieve.
I'd like to read from your wonderful book, All Joy and No Fun: The Paradox of Modern Parenthood, where you point to a Brené Brown lecture where she offers this challenge as to ask, well, what happens next? This is the scenario. It's Christmas Eve, there's a light snowfall, there's a young family of four in a car on the way to Grandma's house for dinner. They're listening to the radio station, the one that starts playing Christmas music like on Halloween. Jingle Bells comes on. The kids in the back seat go crazy. Everyone breaks into song. The camera pans in on the faces of kids and mom and dad. And then Brené Brown asks, well, what happens next? She told the audience the most common answer is car crash. In fact, 60% of all people who respond to this question say car crash. Another 10 to 15% have equally fatalistic answers, says Brown. Brown calls this feeling Foreboding joy. Almost all parents, you write, have known some form of it. These feelings, you write, are the price mothers and fathers pay for elation and for connection. Joy, writes author George Vaillant, is grief inside out, which also then means perhaps that grief is joy inside out.
Absolutely.
In your writing, in your work, have you seen a connection between these two human experiences, joy and grief, and how they inform each other?
It's a funny thing, oh my God, why can't I remember his last name? Dan, he hosts 10% Happier.
Dan Harris?
Harris. He asked me, and I stumbled a lot around this answer until I finally got somewhere. I mean, I said to him, like, I felt like I was on a long ski path doing many switchbacks until I finally found it. I'd never been asked this question either. He said, "Do you think there's an evolutionary purpose for grief? Like why or depression? Why are we sad? You know?" And at first, I really tripped, and I said, "Well, yeah, you're right." Because I mean, let's think about this. I mean, theoretically, if the object is to, evolutionarily speaking, if the imperative is to just keep breeding and have as many children as possible, then we should move on fairly quickly. We shouldn't remain stuck. But of course, connection is essential in all relationships. It's absolutely vital, and it, and joy is it's essential. That's what love is, right? And it's what the psychotic bonding we do to our children is, but also to somebody that we pair off with. And so I think that that's so that if you punch that inside out, you have profound sorrow and grief. You can't have one without the other. You just can't. I mean, the thing about joy, and this is something that George Vaillant also said, is that it's a very hard emotion to tolerate, actually, that it might be harder to tolerate than sadness, precisely because you are opening yourself up to loss. So you do start to love again into, I mean, you are, the second you are healing on some level, I think, if you can start remaking connections, but you are also once again re-exposing yourself. You're making yourself vulnerable all over again, and thus it all continues. And I mean, so you're going to either lead a life that's filled with lots of high and sine curve kind of life, lots of amplitudes, and lots of there's going to be a lot of valleys and troughs, or it's going to look more like a dead person's EKG. It's just going to be phlegmatic. It's just going to which are you going to choose? I actually have a lot of sympathy for people who keep their hearts closed. I understand that, and look, stoicism is like it's one way that one can. I mean, I happen to be a person who lives wildly through my, feelings. So, and one of the ways I subdue them is through writing. But there are all kinds of, characters out there who choose
Right.
how they can best tolerate the difficulties of being alive. So,
Right. Thank you. Uh, I'd like to talk about your book on grief, where you explore different ways that people can grieve, from the concept of feeding our grief to sustaining it, to starving it, to ignoring it, the grief of that something breaks or snaps inside of us, to grief prompting us to try to bring someone back. All these different ways of grieving manifest in the family that you know who lost a son on 9/11. Can you tell us about the McIlvaine family?
yeah, yeah. So my brother was college roommates with this delightful kid named Bobby McIlvaine. Um, they were in the same room for the first couple of years and the same suite, I think, for the last two. They threw their duffel bags on the same bunk bed. And then after college, they moved to New York City and they got a 2-bedroom apartment. They were broke young guys, for 4 more years. And then on September 11th, Bobby left home and never came back. And He was one of the few civilian bodies that was recovered on September 11th. Um, he went up, well, you can kind of recreate what happened. He helped a lower tech colleague who didn't know exactly how to do PowerPoint. He helped him set up before a presentation at Windows on the World. But he left before the planes hit, clearly. He was well outside the building. He was on the periphery of the building, and hence they recovered his body. And so, and his body was mainly intact, but for his head, which is really upsetting. But they found his wallet inside his pants. They found his whole outfit. They were able to identify him from dental records, even if they didn't have his wallet and all these other things and all of his clothes. And so he died. And his parents and his brother, they all grieved in radically different ways. And a therapist gave them a metaphor that many people have written to me since, and written, tweeted at me since, or Facebooked at me since, that they have found very helpful. What's interesting is that some people take real exception to it, but I'll share it anyway. A grief counselor said to the family, grieving, you have to imagine now that you're all at the top of a mountain and you each have a broken leg. And what that means is that you can't rely on the others to get down the mountain. You're going to have to figure out your own way to get down with your own broken leg, because you can't be a support to the person on your left or right. So that really does describe sort of the idiosyncrasy and how isolating it is, even if all three of you are sitting there with a common condition and in a same family. You're all going to have your own ways of scrambling down. And then I had one person, an expert in grief, say to me, "That's lovely, and I don't buy it for a second, because some people have no interest in ever getting down the mountain. They don't want to. It's not, they can't, or they don't want to. It could be both." And that was really interesting to me, because I think to some extent that explained Bobby's father, who every day woke up for 20 years. I mean, I don't know if he's still doing it, but as if it were September 12th, really feeling the wound afresh and treating September 11th like it was a cold case to be solved, and that it was on him to solve it.
How does Bobby's mother's approach differ in regards to how she approached the death of her son?
180 degrees differently. She told me once that she would walk halfway across the country to not do all of the things her husband was doing. Her husband was getting into the forensics of it, like getting the medical examiner's reports, reading up on September 11th and the politics and what happened, and trying minute by minute to recreate in his head what could possibly be going on. This was of zero interest to Bobby's mom. Bobby's mom wanted not to think about September 11th. She didn't want to discuss it. Bobby's father wanted to discuss it with anyone who would ask about it, and he would initiate zillions of conversations about it. And he, as I said, went deep into kind of conspiracy theory land, insisted that the buildings had been brought down by the American government, got involved in like the quote unquote engineers group that had like sort of, declared that steel couldn't burn at a certain, temperature, the whole thing. Bobby's mom didn't talk about it, went so far as to she went to a different grocery store to do her shopping, because she didn't want anybody coming up to her and expressing pity or asking how she was. She didn't want to manage their reactions. She didn't want to hear their fumbling words, even if they were exceptionally well-intentioned. She didn't want to deal with it. Didn't want to deal with other people. And then she discovered at like the 10-year mark that she really did want to talk about it. And she had sort of foreclosed the opportunity to do it because people assumed she'd healed and that she was really aching. And ironically, like talking about it with her husband in some ways they could bond over Bobby and how much they missed Bobby, but she couldn't talk about it in other ways.
One of the things that I think people resonate with in regards to your book is how you validate all those paths. You don't judge Bobby's father or mother. You're not prescriptive, you're descriptive. It felt like you were giving permission for us to find ourselves in each of these individuals. We all might experience grief in those different ways, if you will. We might want to feed our grief or starve it, or we struggle to come down that mountain. Was that your intent in writing the book? To validate all these different approaches to grieving?
Yes, and thank you for noticing, and thank you for being so generous about the framing. It was exactly my intention. Feeding your grief, starving your grief, doing something else, drinking away your grief. People do that for a while. I mean, people do all kinds of things, right? Not that that's a viable life strategy in the long run, but people are going to do whatever they need to do, particularly in the beginning. Um, um, Not endorsing drinking. It was very much my intention. And the only argument that I had with my editor in chief actually centered on this very question. He really wanted me to say that embracing a conspiracy theory was dangerous. And I said, I'm not going to do it. Because, like, on the one hand, you're right. Like, I don't think, they are dangerous. Here, we can see what the conspiracy theory is doing here. It's serving a very particular purpose for Bob, who cannot make sense of this unimaginable, like, his life spun on a dime, and suddenly he was without a son, and he needed a culprit badly, and he needed an explanation badly, and he needed somewhere for all that anger, and it was 100% obvious to anyone who read that story what was going on. I did not need to judge what he chose. If he wanted to believe, I mean, whatever he was going to embrace, he was going to embrace.
What drew you to write about their story at this particular time in your life?
So the really boring journalistic answer is that it was the 20th anniversary, and my editor called me up my fourth day of work at the Atlantic magazine and said, we're doing this this 9/11 package. I usually hate anniversary coverage, but we're doing it. And, we have all this big think stuff, but what we don't have is like any story about a family to whom it happened,
Mhm.
which happened to no one. This is weird because I do. But truthfully, I'd been wanting to write this story for years. I've known the McIlvaines. They are very close to my family. Um, I love Bobby. I thought he was an amazing kid. He was 5 years younger than me, 6 years younger than me. He was just adorable, and really brilliant and original and wholly self-invented. And his parents are marvelous. I particularly love his mom. I mean, I love them both, but I'm closer to his mom, and I know his mom really well. And I became obsessed with an aspect of this story. Bobby kept diaries and journals, and his last diary was sitting on his desk when he died. And Bobby wanted to be a writer, and so he had all these scribblings and jottings and partial kind of novels, written. But this diary was like open and sitting on his desk on September 11th. Not open, shut. But and his girlfriend, who was about to become his fiance, he had bought the ring, was about to propose, and in fact had already asked her dad permission to marry. Um, she took one look at this diary and asked his father if she could have it. And his father, who was in this total fugue state as they were cleaning out his room on September 13th or 14th or whatever day it was, very generously said, of course you can have it, sweetheart. Of course, maybe there'll be something in here that you can use in the eulogy, of course. And when Bobby's mother found out that her husband had given away the last thing Bobby had ever written, a chance to hear their boy saying something new, like a chance almost, it's like a form of literary resurrection, right? He's
Right.
speaking, yeah. She just went crazy, and she asked for that diary back and never got it. And it's a whole story about why she never got it back. But like, She never got it. And so that diary went missing for 20 years. And I was obsessed with it. I wanted it back too. I had fantasies about breaking into Jen's apartment and getting it. And I just thought, it's been 20 years. I'm going to just ask Jen for it back. So that's kind of what sparked it in a funny way.
And did you get the diary back? Tell tell us about that. What was that like?
What is in it? The final page is goose pimpling. Like, oh boy, is there a reason that she hung on to it? And you know what? It belonged to her. I was so angry at her for so long. How could you deprive a mother? It belonged to her. And shame on me for not realizing that, that she had no status. She was in this liminal, horrible perdition where, like, she was not, well, perdition is hell, liminal is being between. She was, if she had been even a fiance, it would have been okay, right? But she wasn't, so she had no claim to anything. And certainly if she'd been his wife, she would have had claim to lots of things. But gosh, what can I say about that diary? There are two things about it that are just shocking. One is the way that it's kind of a time capsule, and the other one is the way that it is eerily prescient. Prescient. It's a crystal ball. Bobby did not know that he was actually writing something about the future, because Bobby writes a lot about grief in that diary, which is also kind of eye-popping. And I'll leave it at that.
And there's a phrase that comes up, and I'm an aficionado of the great song title or the great novel title. And there's a phrase that was important to Bobby's parents. Can you tell us about that phrase?
Trying to think about how much to say about it. I mean, it was this shard of it was these three words that Bobby's parents and Bobby's brother were convinced that Bobby had written, that he had written somewhere "Life Loves On" in one of those diaries, in one of his novels somewhere. It was attributed to him, and it was treated like it was like the family crest. It was, and it had the significance of like Holy Scripture. I mean, it was Bob Sr., Bobby's father, had it tattooed on his arm, and Bobby's mother had it engraved, or a friend made a bracelet that with it engraved on the inside, and she never takes it off. It's on her wrist, and I think Bobby's brother also had it kind of engraved on something that he keeps with him. Like, I think it was a picture frame, or I can't remember what exactly. Anyway, it had outside, it was an organizing motto for their grief: life loves on. And when I finally found this phrase, the story of what it was became so much more interesting and more magical and more extraordinary. Um, it, it, I don't want to say too much about it, but it had this kind of other life and a bit of a twist, and it was sort of very interesting. What's interesting is that you and everybody on the internet, like all the letters I get, everybody on Twitter became obsessed with this phrase too, knowing the full story behind the phrase.
Right.
They got their own tattoos and got mugs and got, like miniature race cars, all kinds of paraphernalia with "Life Loves On" it. It's very catchy. And one librarian, I believe in the UK, found a line of poetry that it appeared in.
I didn't know that.
Well, I didn't either. I had done a Google Books search and couldn't find it, but she had some advanced piece of software that was able to search through poetry, lines of poetry, and found, which I'm sure Bobby was not aware of. It was
Right.
too obscure a poem.
What do you think is the power in that phrase? We spoke about grief being joy turned inside out. Does "Life Loves On" suggest something? Does it point us towards something?
Yes. I mean, like you said, the ability to love again, right? This would suggest some kind of ability to heal. If you're making yourself open to love and to loss all over again, that the cycle continues, right?
Yeah.
So life loving on, that life isn't just about living and surviving. It's about loving on and continuing to love, continuing to expose yourself, right? I think that's the part that we find appealing.
I was taken by this part of the book you described where where Bobby would always give you grief about these pieces that you wrote in New York Magazine, and you'd end them with a quote. And you write, to this day, I credit Bobby with teaching me a valuable lesson. If you're going to see the power of the last word to someone else, you better be damn sure that person deserves it. And this was the concept that helped you in structuring the book. Can you tell us about that?
When I was still a young person too when Bobby died, he noticed an incipient tick in my writing, which is that I had this like little box every week that I wrote about things that were opening on Broadway and off Broadway and off Broadway. And he noticed that whenever I was doing that, I always ended in on a quote. I would interview like a costume designer or a director or an actor. And I never had the guts to sort of take control and write my own kicker, my own final, my own last words, right? And have the final say on where I wanted the piece to land. And Bobby would give me tons of grief about it. And I couldn't believe he read me that attentively or that he noticed. You know, it's a rather attuned form of reading. And he never got to see that I stopped. I stopped. By the time I was a daily book critic, boy, did I stop. I didn't end anything on the authors. I had to have my own point of view. I mean,
Right.
he gave me the tools in some weird way to become a book critic, right? I had to
Mhm.
have my own very forceful convictions about things. Um, and um, that gig didn't last long either because, as you say, I prefer not to judge. It's like not my mode or my register judging. I like letting people live. But and you know, bad literature or books if they're bad for a while, you know, maybe the author gets better. But um, the um, the this piece, yeah, I was sad he couldn't read it
Yeah.
because you know I wanted him to see what I had sort of done with his observation.
Right. Was the response to your piece surprising? I mean, Oprah loved it, and John Green is gushing. I mean, this doesn't happen every day.
It happens never to me. It happens exactly never. Yes.
Exactly, never. Can you walk us through that? Can you let us celebrate with you? What was it like when luminaries on the planet applauded your work?
What was that like? That's such a generous thing. Let us celebrate with you. It was a weird thing to, you know, you know, I felt a lot of feelings. I mean, that was like a tough piece to do, and you're not exactly rejoicing when you're writing about a piece about grief. I mean, a lot of the letters I was getting were from people who were talking about very difficult things that they'd survived. So there was a lot of stuff landing in my inbox that were not encomia from famous people. They were regular people saying how much that, you know, this spoke to them because they'd lost two children or because they, whatever, they'd lost somebody recently or um, lots and lots of letters to write back, right? Also, how old was I when that piece came out? Was I 51? I think I was 51.
Hmm.
And the fact is, when you're 51, you're sort of more happy about getting a good mammogram than you are about getting tweeted by Oprah. You know, like you're facing your own, you know, mortality at that point.
Has your relationship with the piece changed over time?
Good question. Uh,
Do you reread your work? How about that?
I reread that one because that's one that I got right. I don't get them all
Mhm.
right, and some are really hard to reread for that reason.
Hmm.
So if I'm trying to remind myself that I know what I'm doing, I read that piece. But
Hmm.
I sometimes read that piece. I mean, I'm superstitious, so I feel reluctant even talking about this. But you know, I, everybody in my immediate family is still here, right? So and I knew at least how to render the characters and their feelings and their pain
Right.
that I could do. I don't know what questions I didn't ask. I
Hmm.
don't know what things they were saying that on a frequency that my ear was failing to pick up, but I got enough of it that so many people seem to see their own experiences in it that I feel, and also bless my editors, they gave me 13,500 words worth of space right? So that's
Right.
a lot of room to kind of let everybody be themselves in there. And yeah, in terms of a path forward, um, some of that was also the timeline, 20 years, right? You're looking at the arc of a family's grief rather than like snipping it at month 6 or a year or 2 years. I was a judge on the Pulitzers one year for nonfiction, and one of my colleagues, one of the judges I was judging with, was um, this wonderful woman, Sonali. Her last name, I'm not going to mangle it, but it's a polysyllabic Sri Lankan last name. I used to know how to pronounce it, but like you're seeing that I'm forgetting everything. Actually, if I look at it, I will be able to do it. But she wrote this beautiful book called Wave.
Mm.
Um, and we only went by Sonali and Jen when we were talking with our fellow jurors. But anyway, she lost her whole family during the tsunami. She lost her 2 children and her husband and her parents and her closest friend. And when we were judging, it was 18 years hence. And I said to her, that's not a lot of time.
Mm.
And that was the one bit of wisdom I'd gleaned, is that 18 years can mean nothing, And she was very surprised that I said that. She said, you're right. It's not.
Mm.
And I keep feeling like my new reality is just bolted onto this old one, 18 years later. So I learned that in her memoir, Wave. She talked about all of her friends being on suicide watch with her and sitting with her.
Mm.
Something I've never had the courage to ask her is, I mean, I would perhaps want to reserve the right to leave this world. Like it would have been an understandable choice for her if she'd wanted to do it. I'm very glad for all of us that she didn't, and she has rebuilt a really amazing and very interesting life, and she's got a wonderful partner, and it's like super cool. I mean, but I'm interested in that choice, and that her friends felt comfortable making it, and how she feels about it. And
My last question is, our nonprofit is called the Completed Life Initiative, which seeks to invite people to ask the question, well, what is a completed life, both in our living and in our dying? And in many ways, this is the question, or a question, that your book raises for Bobby, who died on 9/11, for his parents who grieved his loss, for your readers. How would you describe for us what is a completed life?
I think about this all the time. I'm obsessed with this question. I mean, the Philip Larkin line about the million-petaled flower of being here, which is perhaps a cliche at this point, but how many petals exactly are we going for, and what constitutes a petal, and have we already lived a million of them? And um, I'll never forget my Uncle Charlie, who died, intellectual, had a correspondence with Joseph Campbell while they were alive. Was very obsessed with myths and symbols, and um, psychiatrist of some renown. He lived until he was like 94 or 5 or whatever he was. I remember once being at the kitchen sink and washing the dishes, and he said to me, Jen, how much time do you need? And I thought he was referring to the dishes. And I said, I don't know, 5 more minutes? And he said, no, I mean here. How much time do you need to do all that you need to do? And he had a very clear answer: 250 years. He knew just how long it would take for him to do all the things that he imagined that he still needed to do. And I thought, that is so interesting. Like, I'm sure that if I lived 250 more years, stipulating that all my loved ones would be here with me, or, the kind of that we all had that life arc, I'd probably then want more at the end of that. I'd get greedy. I think we would just like sort of, it would expand like a gas and just fill the spaces. So what a complete, and also Bobby lived a tragically short life, but he lived a great one.
Hmm.
He was a very happy guy. He played basketball against Kobe Bryant in high school and scored points off the guy, and watched him become famous, and was like, holy mackerel, I scored points off of Kobe Bryant. He studied with Toni Morrison, and she was a big fan. And he went to Spain and went to he traveled way more than anybody in his family did, and went to Princeton. Nobody in his family went to a fancy college at all, and it was unimaginable that when he applied sight unseen. He'd never been. Um, uh, how do you define those things? I think a sense of completedness is something ideally we should achieve while we're here and not looking ahead. I mean, I think we have to figure out some way to feel, the time to start feeling that things are completed around you is now. It's this minute. You know, there was an episode of Heavyweight, which is one of my favorite podcasts, and in some ways, I structured my story about the McIlvaines around an episode of theirs, where he went back and visited a friend who was dying of pancreatic cancer, and his friend said, "Don't waste time being angry. Don't waste your time being pissed." And God, do I spend a lot of time feeling angry sometimes. And it's such a destructive, I mean, as the Buddhists would say, it's such a destructive emotion. It serves no purpose. Why? Why do I spend any time yelling at people in my head? So is a completed life? I mean, have you won the ball game if you can just get rid of your anger?
What struck me too, and maybe you can speak to this, is it felt like Bobby's lesson for us is to take care of the connections that we have in our lives with our family, with our friends. That if we do those things, that's one way that we can measure if our life is complete.
Absolutely. Nurturing those relationships. And we all feel ourselves to be so extraordinarily busy. We all feel like we can't do that. And we should. Um, it's tough. And with the exception of Jack Donaghy on 30 Rock, I don't think anyone has ever been on their deathbed and said, "My God, I wish I worked more, put in more hours in the office." I think that it's very hard for us to figure that out. And it's a choice you have to make daily. As you say, you have to be sort of intentional about it. You have to nurture your connections. And I mean, what is life if it's not connection? I mean, and I shouldn't say that because for some people it isn't. Some people, it's them in their books, and some people, people are, it's them in their music. Um, but I think for the great bulk of us, we're social creatures. It's us and others, and that's the thing you really want to nurture. I think repair is really a big one too. I mean, I think a completed life means making sure that every single relationship you have is, if it's broken, that it's broken in a way that's okay. And if it's in a weak state, to shore it up, fill it in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. If you haven't purchased Jennifer's book yet, it is truly special. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for bringing it into the world. We are delighted that you have been able to be a part of our fall conference.
Thank you for having me here. I have to say it's very special.
Thank you.